In this video, I want to talk about percentages specifically regarding property tax or income tax or other taxes regarding our basic finances. And also, this is particularly useful for your budget project because in your budget project, it's going to ask you to try to figure out, well, what is your income tax and what are your federal and state taxes going to be? Um, when you're adulting and I know some of you already have these things, but for those of you who are students and not working right now, it's something that eventually you're going to have to pay, and it's kind of nice to know how they work. So let's just talk about some basic principles of taxes. But for example, property tax is a tax that you pay on your home, which basically, if you own a home, say for example, you own a home in San Diego worth roughly $600,000, uh, you don't just like once you own something, you don't actually just own it for free. Technically, you still have to pay taxes upon it just for owning it. And the principle behind that is you have some equity in the world, and that allows the government to extract some of that, money from you. Um, and another saying that I thought I'd bring up right now is the only things in life that are inevitable are death and taxes, and that's definitely something that is true. Taxes you're going to have to pay whether you like them or not, just as a price for buying into society. I'm not going to get into ethics or politics or any of that sort of stuff, but again, trying to focus on the math here. But basically, let's say we own this home of $600,000. We want to know, well, how much are we going to have to pay uh, yearly for just owning the home? But in San Diego, the property tax is around, well, actually, this is a little bit old, but let's just assume it is approximately 1.18% of the home value. What that means is that each year we're going to owe the government 1% of our home value, or 1.18% of our home value, in taxes. And if we don't pay that, we're going to be in trouble. So, and since it's a percentage, all we're going to do is we're going to multiply that value into $600,000. And like usual, we need to make sure to convert it to a decimal. And also, as a reminder, if we want to take 1.18% and move it and change it to a decimal, we start with the current decimal point and move that to the left. So as a decimal value, that would be 0.0118. It would not be 0.118. That's a common mistake that I've seen. You don't just move the decimal to the front. You have to move it exactly 2 spaces, which would add an additional, what we call placeholder 0, in this number. Or if you're not a numbers person, you can always just take the percentage, divide it by 100 in your calculator, because that is what the definition of percentage is. But basically, that amounts to a numerical value of 0.0118. And then if we take that and multiply that into the home value, that should give us our property tax. So in this case, our property tax is going to be $7,080. And assuming that that's all that we have to do, and a lot of times taxes are not this simple, and there's other things that we have to take into account. But that tax would be about $7,000 per year. And you could then divide that by 12 to figure out, well, what's the monthly cost of owning the home, which would be approximately $590. And so technically, it's kind of like you're still paying rent in a way. There's no such thing as free, like in terms of, and that's another saying that I bring up for no apparent reason. But it's something that some people aren't even aware that exists. But it's just something to be aware of. If you're going to buy a home, it's another cost. And I mean, really, that's not a very extreme amount of money compared to the value of the home. And anyways, let's move on to the next example. Another type of tax that you're going to have to pay is income tax. So just for being alive, and for making money, you have to pay taxes upon your income. And one estimation of how much the average American has to pay is about 28% as a ballpark. But that percentage changes drastically depending on your tax bracket and depending on how much you make. So the more money you make, if your income is very, very high, you actually have to pay way higher tax percentages back to the government. And if your income's really, really low, it's a smaller percentage. And some people think that doesn't make sense. But really, the people who are poorest can't really afford to lose their money. So that's why they pay a smaller percentage of taxes. And the people who are richer can afford to pay more. And that's kind of the logic. But there's a lot of resentment among people behind, that system. But really, to me, it makes sense. Um, and, and mostly it's wealthy people who don't like it, obviously, because they're paying a much, much higher percentage. And there's a lot of argument for changing the system. Again, I'm not trying to get into all of that stuff. Just so sorry, I'm getting off topic once again. But basically, let's say that your income is $140,000, and we want to know, well, how much am I going to have to pay the government in income tax? And actually, another just thing for you, as a tip for your budget project is typically 21% is federal taxes, the federal government, and 7% is the state government. And actually, I think California is a little bit higher because California everything's more expensive as a general rule. But you are allowed to use these figures, or if you want, you can look up tax calculators. Say you're not going to live in California and you want to predict how much it's going to be. What you want to do is figure out, well, what's your estimated income going to be in a few years once you get a job, and then where will you be living and how much taxes will you probably have to pay. You can actually just use an online calculator for all this if you want. Or you can use these general estimated figures. But if your income is going to be significantly higher, you might want to look at your actual tax bracket, which will be different. But we're just using the estimated 28% in this example. And that's what they mean by tax brackets is like if your income is say between 100 and 140,000, you're going to have a particular percentage, and that percentage will change based on how much you make. And for the purposes of a budget project, I don't care. You can just use the estimated figure, but it will obviously matter in actual practice. So anyways, let's just assume that this is true. Basically, I would need to take 20% of my income, and that's going to go to the government. And in this case, that amounts to $39,200 in taxes. And what that means is I don't actually really get that full salary. That doesn't all go into my checkbook or my savings account. Really, 40,000 of that goes directly to the government. So really what I see as my income after taxes is about $100,000. So that's why most people care about what is your after-tax income, not before tax, because really the before-tax income is kind of meaningless in terms of how much money we actually get at the end of the day. And doing your taxes is a whole nother thing where you kind of have to calculate, well, how much taxes am I paying? And there's all sorts of other things that, you get deductibles, so you don't have to pay as much. But typically your job will take out and do those basic calculations for you to see about how much you need to take out month by month so that you don't have to pay this all at the end of the year. Because one thing that would be a really horrible system is, let's say your work gave you all of this money directly, then at the end of the year you have to pay all this. Most people, don't manage their money well enough to have $40,000 sitting around in their account to pay that all off at once. So most of the time the job will take it out for you. But people who own businesses, a lot of times if you're your own manager, you don't have that luxury of having someone else to do the tax prep or those basic calculations for you. So you have to kind of think about, well, how much taxes am I paying in addition? Say you're making $80,000 a year selling stuff, you still have to pay taxes upon that. And if you don't, you could be in trouble with the IRS. Anyways, let's do one more example, and then we will say that'll wrap it up for this week. So the last one comes with percent off and using that the formula calculator that I showed you before. But this is another question that a lot of people will struggle with, and I wanted to kind of show you the idea of how we could do it. So example 6 says a tablet is originally priced at $499 and is then marked down to $424.15. What percent discount did we get on this tablet? But basically, I wanted to remind you about that formula, and it's kind of just a useful one to remember for doing such things. But the percent change in the value of the tablet, it's always going to be the original cost minus the reduced cost as a ratio to how much this originally costs. And why this is going to make sense mathematically, if I just do that difference in the numerator, that would give me basically my savings over the original. But basically, if I want to know, what percentage, off did I get in this particular example, if I just take that exact ratio of the difference, basically what this number is how much did I save? How much did I get off out of the original? And this makes sense as a percentage. Let's go ahead and do that because it might make more sense after we kind of can see the numbers. But after we take that ratio, what that gives me is 15% or 0.15. So, and another thing about percentages, when we're solving these formulas mathematically, a lot of times we get an answer, but it's kind of important to be able to interpret. Okay, well that means 15%. In this context, but basically a percent off, what that means is, well, how much did I get off as a percentage? It's always a ratio to the original, because that's how percentages work. It's a new number coded to the fact of 100. And it's hard to see just, well, if I look at just the difference in the price, it's hard to know what that is as a percent, but I need to, if I divide by the original cost, it normalizes it to a percentage format, kind of removing the scalar value from it. Sorry, I'm using too much math lingo right now. But basically, when I do that, it basically converts the number to a generic percentage form, which is now with reference to 100%. And the reason why percentages are so common and ubiquitous is it's a little bit easier to understand it in this context than in this context. This ratio is a little bit harder to really visualize, and if we just normalize it to 100, it's a little bit more understandable and takes the scale, the size of those numbers out of the picture. But anyways, what we can conclude is we got 15% off on that tablet. And then I could double check to make sure. We could use the same trick I did before, where 15% off means 85% of the original, and see if that all adds up. And yeah, we can see that if we're going to take 15% off of the tablet cost, that will give us exactly what we want, $424.15, and it makes sense, and I can check my solution. That'll wrap up for now. Next week, we'll continue with the packet and the slides, and we'll talk about compound interest. Basically, if I have a checking account or a loan, how does the interest grow? And look at, we're not actually going to look at this math, but I did want to show you a little bit of, there's some calculus that is involved in those, which we're not going to do the calculus, but we will look at the results, and I think it is relevant. Talk a little bit about things like APY, doubling time, stuff like that, and then eventually work into debt. Like say you have credit card debt or student loans, and you want to know, how is this gonna affect my finances? That will all be next week. Anyways, that's it for this video. See you next time. Hope you all are doing well.